Hi everybody. Just finishing up my work week and have had some thoughts going through my head regarding the COVID-19 crisis and our state of affairs, and I thought I would share them on video. And as I've been contemplating where we're at and sharing these thoughts, that the thought came to my mind that this might be better shared more from a coaching type platform. Therefore, I have the whiteboard behind me, which is kind of a favorite tool for coaches, and we'll get to that in just a second. But along those lines of using a coaching platform, I have been reflecting back to what we always used to tell our kids, is that we have to learn to lose properly, learn to lose well before we're going to be winners. And the idea behind that was that when we lost, we were going to grieve those losses fully. We were going to take a little bit of time to restore and recharge. And then we're going to get back at it, and we're going to look at what went well and what didn't go well, and then start a new game plan for a new week with the hopes of doing it better. And approaching it that way always leads to improvement and to success. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. We've suffered a lot of losses, including lives. Which is truly sad, but we have a lot of other losses, including jobs and financial security, and this is going to deserve a long look at how we can do things better. And part of that for me is this introduction to the idea of threat and stress and what it does, not only to our minds and our bodies, but what it does to us socially and culturally, and the fact that we need to fully understand this as we evaluate this crisis and every other crisis, so that we can come up with a better game plan and we can do things better the next time around. So with that, I am going to shed my doctor's coat and put on my coach's hat and go to the whiteboard. Give me a sec. So, as I indicated, we're going to talk about threat and stress, and the most important thing that we're going to start with is this idea of threat, but I just want to make one comment about stress. We can have good stress in our lives. When we go out for a run or we go for a workout, that's a stress to our body, and it's very adaptive. It makes us stronger and more resilient, but it's done when we're not under threat. And so that physiology of getting out and exercise is super important for us. It makes us feel good, and as I said, it makes us more resilient. It boosts our immunity. It helps with our emotions. It helps us to relax. It helps us to sleep at night. But this idea of threat stress is significantly different. It's a different type of stress, and so we're going to dig into that. Now we have the acute stress response, and then we have the chronic stress response, and we'll go into some detail on that. But let's start just talking about what's a threat. So let's say I'm walking down the street in bare feet in the summertime, and I step on a tack, and that hurts, and that sends a signal up my nerves into my spinal cord, and it goes up to my brain, and it registers and it activates the threat response. So that's a signal that says, hey, danger here. You're being physically injured or harmed, and you need to pay attention and figure out how to get out of this situation. So the senses that come from our body can signal threat when they're So we have a lot of signals coming up from our body, including sharpness, like stepping on a tack, but temperature too. It signals us if it's too intense, that it may burn us, it may harm us, it may damage our tissues. We have other senses too: touch, pressure, vibration, position sense. Any of these things in the extreme can become uncomfortable, can become aversive, and can stimulate physical pain responses. And part of the physical pain response is to activate the threat response. So we also have signals that come in from our viscera, from our heart, our lungs, our stomach, our intestines, our liver, and it's a little different. It is a little bit more vague. It tends to come on more like an ache. Sometimes it will elevate to actual sharpness and pain. And sometimes our viscera actually are signaling things like queasiness or nausea. But equally so, if there's an uncomfortable sensation, an aversive sensation coming up from our organ system, it's going to also activate our threat response. It's saying, hey, pay attention, what's going on here? You need to figure out how to find safety and try to eliminate whatever this toxic sensation is. So our physical bodies signal to us threat and activate this whole stress cascade, and this is a mechanism. It's adaptive. It's for our survival. But if the threat stress system goes on too long, if it becomes chronic, we can see a real deterioration in our physiology. So other things that evoke stress are lions, tigers, and bears. Obviously, they can do physical damage. Other people potentially can do physical damage if they're wielding a weapon, even more so. But what we're talking about here today is a virus, the COVID-19 virus. So that gets into our body, and that activates our threat stress response, which activates our immune response. So the threat stress response is essentially the same for all of these threats, and obviously the people who get COVID-19 virus and go on and get a bacterial pneumonia, they have another activator of the threat stress response in a bacteria. So I want to put that out there in the framework, but I also want to talk about, we've been talking about all these feelings that come in from our body, that come in from our cranial nerves, through our senses, that come from our viscera, our organ system, but we have another set of feelings, and those are our emotions. And we have to keep these things in mind during this time of crisis, because they are significant. So we have pleasant emotions, we have joy and we have love, but we also have these uncomfortable, aversive emotions that also, if they get too intense, they are perceived as being painful. Things like fear, sadness, anger, shame, guilt, embarrassment, disgust. They're all emotions we don't really want to feel, and a lot of times we try to push them aside, which causes other problems. But nevertheless, they're emotions we don't want to feel, and we frequently refer to them as negative emotions. But they aren't really negative, they're positive, because we wouldn't have them if they were truly negative. We need these other emotions for our survival, just like we need to understand when our tissues are being damaged by something sharp or something hot. So one of the things we have to do in these times is understand that these aversive emotions can also be destructive to us, but in a slightly different way than being burnt or stabbed or something like that. So our emotions, a lot of them are dictated also by other people, about how other people are communicating with us. So we can have rancid food that makes us gag and barf, and we can come across rancid people. Certainly if somebody calls you an idiot or something like that, that's really perceived as being painful to us. And then we also have our own thoughts, and we can have negative thoughts. We can have an ongoing monologue in our head of negativity that will activate some of these aversive emotions and kind of perpetuate the threat-stress response. And we have something very interesting going on in our brain. So our subconscious brain has millions more times the activity going on in it than our conscious brain. And within the subconscious brain, we are constantly running predictive codes. And these predictive codes are really designed to look at our environment and help us determine whether we're safe or we're in danger. And you can see why that would be adaptive and help with our survival. The idea that there's all this activity going on in our subconscious, constantly running predictive codes, takes a certain amount of energy to do that, to determine whether we're safe or in danger. We're completely unaware that this is going on. I mean, we're aware now because we're talking about it, but day to day, we don't have a sense that this activity is really going on in our brain. So these predictive codes can also then activate the threat response. If a predictive code says, something seems dangerous here, it can activate the threat response before we're even conscious that there might be something in our environment that's actually threatening to us. So what are the types of things that play a part in these predictive codes? Well, one of them is our genetics. We have some genetic predisposition to be fearful of certain things. It does look like we have a genetic predisposition to be fearful of heights and fearful of falling. We also have a number of reflex activities that are built into us. So a loud sound, we're going to do that, and it's going to activate our threat-stress response. Bright flashing lights, we're going to do this, and it's going to activate our threat-stress response. Put a rancid piece of meat in your mouth, and it's going to make you gag and barf and activate the threat-stress response. So we have this genetic wiring that through subconscious mechanisms can activate the threat-stress response. We also have something basically epigenetic wiring where our DNA is modified and it can be modified by traumas, physical or psychological traumas. And interestingly, the modification of our DNA to traumas in our lives can be passed to the next generation. Or if you look at yourself, you go, my parents and my great-grandparents and maybe my great-great-grandparents, whatever traumas they may have experienced may be passed to me through the genetic process, through this epigenetic modification of our DNA, and that can predispose us to having a hyperactive threat-stress response as well. And then we have all of our life experiences. And so as we're going through life, we are storing information down into the subconscious part of the brain, and it uses it to manage these predictive codes and helps to determine whether this is a safe situation or whether we're in danger. So this gets very interesting if you look at the adverse childhood event literature. Kids who have had psychological, physical, perhaps sexual trauma in their life, they have a hyperactive threat-stress response. And unfortunately, having a hyperactive threat-stress response leads to a variety of physical and mental health issues. So if you can imagine being a child who has a parent who at times seems to be loving and caring, and you're dependent on that parent, and you create a predictive code for that parent that they are loving and caring and I'm going to be safe with them. But at other times, they are angry and abusive, and you have a predictive code for that. You can imagine in this subconscious brain running those two predictive codes for a parent, and not just having this this one predictive code that they're a threat, but actually running two predictive codes that are in conflict with each other. And we know that just that conflict itself elevates threat stress, let alone the issues of abuse. So this whole operation that works in our brains kind of in the shadows can be stimulating our threat stress response. Now there's some other mechanisms at play in this realm that we don't understand very well, but we do know that that human beings, in order to function successfully day to day, will be able to suppress some negative thoughts. We'll be able to compartmentalize some thoughts, set them aside so that they don't have sort of an emotional breakdown in the middle of their workday. And we also know we do something similar with these aversive, uncomfortable emotions. If they well up in us in the middle of a workday, we're going to repress them. We're going to stuff those emotions somewhere and not deal with them right now. Unfortunately, if we don't deal with the compartmentalized thoughts and the stuffed emotions, at some point they tend to come back and haunt us. And so all of these suppressions and repressions that are also down in the shadows of our brain or the shadows of our mind can also activate the threat response. So you can imagine if you have a lot of predictive codes in your mind that the world is a dangerous place, you're going to tend to see danger everywhere. And if you've had past traumas, emotional or even physical traumas, and you have repressed those or stuffed those someplace, they're going to amplify that even more, and you're going to have a baseline level of kind of chronic threat stress running through your system all the time, and that can become very problematic. So one of the things that I always want people to appreciate is this idea that we have these sensations coming in through our body. That's a form of feelings, and they can, if they're too intense, they become uncomfortable and they can become physical pain. And then we have these other feelings, these emotions that flow through us, coming from all of these sources, and if they become too intense, the aversive emotions become very uncomfortable, and they can also feel like pain. Now, if we actually look at our system, you could say that physical pain is running on a track on the right rail, and emotional pain is running on a track on the left rail, and they're coupled. They're on the same track. So if you're jacking up physical pain, your spiritual pain is going to come right along with it. If you're jacking up spiritual pain, your physical pain is going to come right along with it. So you've got this common track that they're running on, and then this track has a center rail that they share as well. And that center rail is the threat stress response that we're talking about. So let's take a break from that for a second, and I want to do a really brief review of anatomy because it is going to become pertinent to the discussion. So here in this big mess, in the middle of the big mess, I've got a picture of the brain, starting at the brain stem. So this area is the medulla, the pons, the cerebellum, the midbrain. So the brain stem comes up and it sort of evaginates up into the hemispheres of the brain. So it's much like a mushroom, with the stalk of the mushroom coming up and then the mushroom cascading over that. So you have a little bit of overlap here, but you can imagine the midbrain is up into the big hemispheres of the brain a little bit. And then as we come up, we've got this area of the brain, which is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is really geared toward action. So this is the motor strip that gets our arms and legs moving. And in here we have some motor association areas that help coordinate our movements. And then other parts of our brain, like this area here, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as well as this area here, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, are more involved in things like attention and initiation that affect us and the behaviors that then we execute through the motor system. This little area here is the part of our brain that's responsible for our ability to express language. So what's important to know here is this stuff makes us very distinctly human. We call it the neocortex. We clearly have more intellect. We are very social. We're kind of a wimpy species and we can't survive by ourselves. We need a tribe, we need support, so we have to have a big social kind of connection network in our brain so that we can cooperate and go out and hunt together and have some success in hunting together. And we also have a communication system. Our language system is clearly more robust than any other animal on the planet. So this stuff up here is not only devoted to action, but it is stuff that really makes us uniquely human. This back part of the brain, which I'm not going to deal too much with, is more devoted to sensation. So this is the somatosensory strip where all this information from our body is coming in. And then back here is our visual cortex, where we process images and light into vision. And right in here is an area that's devoted similarly to sound and hearing. And then we have this temporal lobe here, which is very interesting. It houses memory, and it also has a lot of emotional content in that area. I think it's really interesting to note that we have this massive brain and these massive heads, and maybe in order to consolidate that our viscera, our organ system, not so much the senses coming from our extremities, but our viscera really deep in the brain tends to share a sensory system with our emotional system. And that's why so frequently, when you're sad, you may have a stomach ache. When you're angry, you may have neck and back pain. When you're fearful, you may be tight in your chest and experience chest pain. They're tightly integrated with each other. So with that background, let's move forward to what is really going on in the brain when we experience a threat. So again, we covered a laundry list of things that can be threatening to us, and they essentially all activate the same system. We don't have the luxury of having a stress response for a bear, and a different threat stress response specifically for a virus or another threat stress response when we're being attacked emotionally. It tends to pretty much run the same course. This little area here is called the amygdala, and that's our threat center. That we have one on each side. They exist in the temporal lobes. They're about the size of an almond, but under chronic stress threat, they tend to grow. And this is what, when there is a threat, this alarm system activates and creates a cascade of events throughout our brain and our body. So we're gonna come back to that in just a second. I want to talk a little bit about this area in the midbrain. That's the ventral tegmentum, and that is flushed with dopamine. So dopamine is a feel-good neurotransmitter, and it is involved in not only a sense of well-being, but a sense of openness, typically when we're not in fight or flight, and a very upright and open posture, and it's tightly integrated into our pleasure reward system. So dopamine is released whenever we have a success, but unfortunately it's also released when we use substances like cocaine to give the pleasure effect of cocaine. Right here, this little area is called the locus coeruleus. It's full of norepinephrine, or we're going to call it noradrenaline, because people tend to be more comfortable with the idea of adrenaline. It's the same thing. We all know adrenaline comes out from our adrenal gland. So this is a cousin, essentially, of adrenaline. It's called noradrenaline. And noradrenaline is an activating neurotransmitter. It brings us to attention. It brings us to being alert. It also supports our heart rate and our respiratory rate and our blood pressure. So when we have a good level of noradrenaline, we tend to be able to really focus and concentrate. Unfortunately, when noradrenaline starts to go a little high, that's when we start to get a little jittery, a little twitchy. We can't quite think as well, and we get fearful. May start as anticipation, maybe even excitement, but move into maybe a little bit of fear, anxiety, and then potentially on into panic. And then down here, we've got this little chain of purple blobs called the raphe nuclei, and they're full of serotonin. So serotonin also is a feel-good neurotransmitter, but it's unlike dopamine, which tends to be a little activating. Serotonin is a little bit more kind of a chill neurotransmitter. It's a little bit more relax and connect with people. So it's very pro-social, and as we talked about, we are social animals. And then we have these two interesting nuclei down here, the dorsal motor nucleus and the nucleus ambiguus. So these two nuclei combine to kind of settle us down. The dorsal motor nucleus is actually, it activates to help us conserve energy and recover and restore. So we get into dorsal motor nucleus type tone when we're in deep sleep. Animals get into it when they're hibernating, and it is a mode where our blood pressure drops, our respiratory rate drops, our heart rate drops. We are not consuming a lot of energy in our body. We are sleepy, maybe asleep. Also, it tends to shut our cortical brain off a little bit and give it a break to restore itself. This nucleus ambiguus is part of our system, which, whatever you want to call it, we can call it feed and breed, rest and digest, relax and sex. So these two areas, and this is a more primitive part of the brain, so these are relatively primitive to what's going on up here, but they're more responsible for kind of a deactivation type response. So anyway, now let's move on now that we've got the landscape here. So a threat comes in and from that long laundry list, and the amygdala jacks up. What happens when that happens? So the amygdala is going to send a signal to the hypothalamus, to the pituitary, to the adrenal gland, and it's basically saying, I need some good stress hormones. And by the way, while you're making these good stress hormones, I don't need any sex hormones. I don't need any anabolic hormones. I just want the stress hormones to help me get through this threat, to help me get out of danger, to help me survive. So what comes out? Well, out of the adrenal gland, adrenaline comes out. And adrenaline is very activating. It is going to boost up our heart rate. It's going to increase the force of contractions of our heart. It's going to boost up our blood pressure, and it's going to boost up our respiratory rate, and it's going to activate us. We're going to attend and take note that we are in danger, and we got to figure a way out. The other thing from the adrenal gland, from the cortex of the adrenal gland, comes cortisol, and cortisol under threat stress is really primarily there to make sure we have enough fuel to sustain the fight or the flight. So cortisol actually starts to break down our tissues, particularly our proteinaceous tissues, our muscles, and allow us to use those for fuel if we're in a prolonged fight or flight, and we don't have time to eat, and our guts shut down anyway, so we're not going to want to eat, and yet we'll have enough fuel to survive. The other thing that comes out, so that actually goes, those hormones get released into our bloodstream, but then we also have our nervous system being very engaged in this effort as well. So we secrete the noradrenaline from here. And again, noradrenaline brings us to attention. It's very activating, and it can, as it gets too high, start to make us a little bit more fearful and panicky. Now down here, these things become very important in chronic threat stress. They're important in acute stress threat, but the amygdala tells the nervous system to put out a bunch of glutamate. So glutamate is an excitatory transmitter, and what it does is it activates all of our nervous system, so our senses are more acute, and it also helps embed memory and pathways. So if we run into a tiger in the woods and we have this experience, this big blast of glutamate is going to help embed that as a memory, so the next time we run into the tiger, we might be better at fighting him off. Unfortunately, with glutamate, in addition to being excitatory, it also, in too high a doses for too long, can become toxic. So under high levels of glutamate for too long, we actually see certain parts of our brain where the dendrites of the neurons, the little connections coming out from the neurons, start to wither, and eventually the neurons actually die, and you start seeing shrinking of the brain, which has a lot of medical implications. The amygdala also starts the flow of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and these are the chemicals that make us feel stiff and achy a little bit if they're in our system too long, but they set the platform for the inflammatory response and the immune response, so that if we get bit by the tiger or scratched by the tiger, or it takes a chunk out of us and leaves a lot of bacteria behind, because 150,000 years ago we didn't have antibiotics, we need a really aggressive inflammatory response and immune response, and these guys set the table for that. And cytokines come out also from our white blood cells. They produce cytokines. Our fibroblasts, which are cells in our connective tissue, they produce cytokines, but the nervous system here also produces a lot of cytokines. And then Histamines kind of are up here. We all know histamines and antihistamines. So histamines produce allergic reactions, but it is part of producing a good inflammatory and immune response to any physical trauma. So we've kind of got the chemistry going, we got the anatomy going. So let's take a look at what we actually look like when we're in fight. So when we move into a fight physiology, we get irritable. That is advantageous. It's not a time to bond and make love, particularly with a tiger attacking you. So you tend to get irritable and angry and perhaps even rageful. Now, as long as we're winning the fight, we're going to have both noradrenaline flowing, as well as dopamine. And dopamine in this context can make us a little bit more courageous. But if we either imagine we're going to lose the fight or we're getting our ass kicked, our dopamine level will drop and we'll lose our sense of confidence and be slightly less aggressive. And in this window, we're now converting from fight into flight, where it's a low dopamine and high noradrenaline state. So in flight, we're going to have more fear. We're going to be more vigilant. We're going to have insomnia. We're not going to be able to sleep when the tiger's out there in the woods. We're going to stay on guard. So fight and flight are slightly different. Both of them are relatively low serotonin, right? It's not a time to be particularly social. Fight has dopamine and norepinephrine and kind of upright posture. Flight, not so much dopamine, more norepinephrine. Now we're a little bit more twitchy and anxious and kind of ready to run. But both of these states are characterized by mobilization, reaction or reactivity, and inflammation. We need to be reactive. It's not a time to contemplate our belly button either. So, and we have a good inflammatory response. So you can imagine that this fight and flight consumes quite a bit of energy. And if you know you're going to get your ass kicked, or you are getting your ass kicked, or you're running out of gas, we need to have a backup option. In fight or flight, we're mobilizing resources, we're mobilizing energy sources, but we're also consuming energy sources. And you can imagine without being able to take any energy in, that this is not completely sustainable. And it's also advantageous if you're getting your ass kicked to try a different strategy. So what happens, and this is the model for this is really based on cytokine output. When the cytokine levels get too high under extreme threat stress, then we have a conversion. And it may happen that when cytokine levels get to a certain concentration, that they saturate some different receptors that then shuts down the ventral tegmentum, the locus coeruleus, and the raphe nuclei. We see a dramatic reduction in these hormones. So there is the model that this dorsal motor nucleus is responsible for the shutdown of the fight or flight response. And what happens when the dorsal motor nucleus gets activated, not only does it shut off all of these neurotransmitters, but it basically shuts down the whole system. So when the dorsal motor nucleus, probably activated by extremely high pro-inflammatory cytokines, signals shut down, we essentially are in a surrender mode. We go from the the sort of angry, aggressive posture of fight or flight, or the jittery posture, of fight, to the jittery posture of flight, to one of defeat. We're slumped, we're stooped, and that's called freezing. We're surrendering. We need to conserve resources. We need to immobilize. We need to retreat, and we need to surrender. And so, in this posture, or in this low neurotransmitter status, our posture then converts to being slumped and stooped, defeated. And if it goes on to be more severe, we go from freeze to actual faint, where we collapse and frequently end up actually on the ground in a fetal position, even more curled up. So this makes some sense that if you're running low on resources, if you're becoming exhausted, or if you're just getting your ass kicked and there's no more point in trying to fight or flee, that you would just shut it down. So these two states of freeze and faint are characterized by a significant drop in hormones, loss of these transmitters, and weirdly, the pro-inflammatory cytokines stay high. In fact, they are the things that are signaling us that we're going to stay in freeze and faint. So again, we appear withdrawn. Chronically, we appear depressed. We can actually have some dissociation, where we start to disconnect from our upper brain, and so we lose that connection with our sense of self, our sense of our body, a sense of the world, and then going into frank collapse. So the freeze and faint physiology is characterized by immobilization and energy conservation, but it's still pro-inflammatory because the cytokines are high. Now I want to talk about immunity here. So in this state of fight or flight, our immunity is maybe even jacked up. Our system is geared to fight a virus, it's geared to fight a bacteria, and if we get slashed by the tiger, it's geared to deal with that as well. What happens in freeze and faint, though, is different. We see a drop in immunity. We still are pro-inflammatory, but our immune cells are not going to work well when we're in the influence of this dorsal motor nucleus, and we're either in freeze or worse, in faint. Now, the specific mechanisms by which that occur are not entirely clear, but we do know that our immune cells have receptors for dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, and if the dorsal motor nucleus has shut down all of our metabolism, essentially, including shut down the production and release of these neurotransmitters, arguably that could be the mechanism that shuts off our immune cells. So not only do we look physically depressed, our metabolic system is depressed, and our immune cells are also depressed in the state of freeze and faint. So that has some really interesting implications when you're fighting a virus. So let's go ahead and switch gears here and come back up to this upper part of the brain, because it's very fascinating what we do when this amygdala is jacked, or when both our amygdalae, I guess, are jacked up, and they're spewing out adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, glutamate, pro-inflammatory cytokines, and histamines. What's going on up here? So this is our action part of the brain, right? We talked about that. Well, interestingly, when we're in fight or flight, we do not need a lot going on in our prefrontal cortex. We don't need a lot going on in our neocortex, the part of us that makes us distinctly human. What we need is much more activity in our animalistic brain, the part of our brain that is going to be better at reacting and fighting or fleeing than the part of our brain that is going to be contemplating quantum physics or trying to connect with somebody or make love to somebody. That's just not important. So we actually have built in to us the ability to shut down this part of our brain, including the cortical language part of the brain, through different mechanisms. One of them is when noradrenaline goes very high, it will saturate these receptors that have a relatively low affinity for this transmitter, but when it goes into high doses, they get stimulated, and that causes decreased blood flow to this part of our brain. So that partly turns it off. But in this model, with these cytokines flowing, these pro-inflammatory cytokines, it appears that they also have the ability to interfere with neurotransmission. So we're not making the electrical connections through the neurologic system, and we've also cut down some of the blood flow to this part of our brain, the neocortex, that makes us distinctly human. So what do we look like when that happens? Well, as we were talking about earlier, this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is really our IQ. It's our intellect. It's our it brings us to attention. It allows us to initiate things and initiate activities, but more importantly, it's involved in reasoning, planning, strategizing, rational thought, creativity, which are super unique to humans. It's our strength to problem solve and create new stuff, make tools, all that kind of thing. And then this part here, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, is our pro-social aspect of our brain, which we talked about how we really need to be social. We need to cooperate with other human beings because we're so weak and wimpy, we can't survive out in the jungle on our own, but we do really well as a tribe. So we have to be able to connect. But when we're under threat, a virus, a tiger, a really toxic human being, it's not time for those things. It's time to fight, flee, perhaps freeze and faint. So this goes offline as well. So this area is responsible for connection and bonding. It's responsible for empathy. This is where our moral judgment exists, and this is where moral decisions are made. And then this little area here that we were talking about earlier is a language center. It's expressive language center. And it's interesting that it goes offline as well. So we can't spit out sentences or paragraphs. We can't articulate ourselves very well. We have stuff racing through our brains, but we can't get it out of our mouths. So the cortical language goes offline. Now we're still really good at grunting, groaning, screaming, yelling when we're under threat and stress. And interestingly, emotional language can be preserved, which is profanity. So we're really good at profanity when we're in fight or flight. When we go down into freeze and faint, those things, even the emotional language and communication starts to go offline, and we look more mute than animated and communicating, even with grunts and yells. So let's go over to this part of the board here and just go down what we actually look like when we're under threat. So let's start with the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This is the equivalent of our EQ, our emotional quotient. So we show decreased connections with people, decreased bonding, decreased empathy, decreased moral judgment, decreased remorse, decreased ethics. We are more selfish. We practice more isolation. We can become more depressed. We can go through dissociations and frank psychosis when these parts of the brain start to go offline. Now, if we are under threat and stress and we've shut down our dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, or our IQ, we show decreased initiation, we show decreased attention, decreased concentration, decreased reasoning, decreased planning, decreased strategizing, decreased working memory. That's the ability to take a concept in our mind and kind of play with it and work with it. We show decreased insight, decreased judgment, decreased rational thought, and we show more paranoia, we show more prejudice, and we have more misperceptions and mispredictions. So, and if you remember, we were talking about our subconscious predictive codes going on all the time. They get biased under threat stress, and they can lead us to prejudice and misperceptions and mispredictions. And then, as we were saying before, our cortical language goes offline. We're really good at yelling, screaming, and swearing. So, with all of this, now we can talk a little bit about what its implications are in terms of the COVID-19 crisis. So the first thing that comes to mind, having just finished this topic, is toilet paper. So we noted there was a crisis coming, perhaps. Maybe it wasn't quite here, but we were warned and there was going to be a crisis. So immediately we feel threatened, right, by that information. The stuff coming to us all the time across different media can be threatening to us, whether it's social media or our news channels. So we go, oh gosh, crisis is coming, we better prepare. Well, our predictive codes for most crises are really around environmental events, you know, a hurricane, a tornado, a blizzard, snowstorm, a flood. All those types of things are kind of where our predictive code is. And in those situations, what frequently happens is, you know, we lose clean water, we lose a power, we lose electricity, we can't get gas to the gas stations, we can't get food to the stores, we can't get toilet paper to the stores, right? And so our predictive code says, oh, crisis coming, we need to run out and get flashlight batteries and toilet paper and food. And in the process of doing this, we've converted here. We become selfish and we take more maybe than our fair share to stock up. And in fact, we become less reasonable under threat and stress. So if we had been reasonable, if our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was actually working, we might sit back and go, this crisis is infectious, and you know, our supply chain may stay intact, our roadways will be intact, our railways will be intact, our airways will be intact, our shipping lanes will be intact, and we're going to keep essential people online. So, you know, we probably are going to, at least for the short run, be able to continue to deliver toilet paper and food to the stores, and that perhaps all these staples aren't really the things that we need to worry about. And I would argue that to some extent, that we actually do have the ability to keep some of these essentials online, and we don't need to panic around that. Now, the one resource that if it does become scarce, that can be extremely threatening to us, and the one that we should have been focused on was money. Because when money becomes scarce, people are going to be more threatened. And when people are more threatened, you're going to see more deterioration in these parts of the brain, and you're going to see more what we would call bad behavior. I will comment on that, though. This is just normal behavior for people under threat stress. So when you see people behaving this way, selfishly, irrationally, yelling and screaming and swearing, you can say that person is under threat stress, and they're doing absolutely what they should be doing under threat stress. They are doing what their nervous system, their hormonal system is telling them they need to do to survive. And so the cure isn't to try to fix them. The cure is to try to decrease their threat-stress load. And if you decrease their threat-stress load, they will come back to behaving the way we would like everybody to ideally behave. And this is where we have to discuss the fact that when we are not under threat and stress, we are indeed a moral animal. We are very socially connected. We are reasonable and rational. But when we're under threat stress, we become not so nice. And you can say we're an amoral animal. It's a little judgmental because our mind and our body is doing exactly what it should be doing if we're in threat stress. Okay, so shift gears off of that and go into a little bit more about what happens to a COVID-19 patient. So their body's being attacked by a virus. They may get a bacterial pneumonia, and so they've got another attack there. They may be socially insecure, financially insecure. They may have a past history of significant traumas in their life, either psychological or physical. They may also have multiple medical comorbidities. People who are struggling to defeat the virus tend to have more obesity, more diabetes, more kidney disease, more heart disease, more lung disease. So if you look at this equation and you start stacking the threat stress load on people, the virus in somebody who already has a fairly high threat stress load in their body, the virus can be enough to push that load over the top. So, so somebody who we know that people have had adverse childhood events, have a hyperactive threat stress response, and they're more predisposed to illnesses and disease. We also know that poverty in and of itself is a threat stress. And so those people also tend to be more predisposed to illnesses and disease, and their lack of financial security increases their threat stress load even further. We know that minorities, and particularly minorities who are being discriminated against, have an increased threat stress load. And so they're going to be more susceptible to illness and disease and inability to fight off a virus or a bacteria. So we have to take each patient individually and see what they look like and see how their total threat stress load added up prior to the attack of the virus. And if we do that, we can predict who's going to have a bad outcome. And interestingly, age is a factor in that as well. And mental illness is a factor in that as well. So what corresponds with this threat stress load stacking up that can push somebody over the top? Well, we talked about the amygdala jacking up all of these things. It's this one here, the pro-inflammatory cytokine, that are particularly suspect in this equation. So as the threat stress load goes up, our pro-inflammatory cytokines go up. And we know that victims of adverse childhood events have elevated cytokine levels. We know that every psychiatric diagnosis has an increased pro-inflammatory cytokine level associated with it. We know that people with comorbidities have increased pro-inflammatory cytokine levels. Now the question there is, did those pro-inflammatory cytokines cause their illness and disease, or do those comorbidities cause an increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines? Chicken and egg. And the answer is both. Both are true. So, what are people dying from? with COVID-19 infections. They're not dying from viral load. They're dying from cytokine storms. So a cytokine storm induces a shock syndrome. And the shock syndrome's not as that important, or septic shock syndrome, acute respiratory distress syndrome, systemic inflammatory response syndrome. These are all induced by a cytokine storm. So you can imagine that if you have a baseline level of high stress threat with a baseline level of high circulating cytokines, and now you stack a viral infection on top of that, another threat, your cytokine level goes even higher. And let's say you stack a bacterial pneumonia on that, your cytokine level goes higher. Your body, in fighting this infection, is working in a fight or flight mode. It's working as hard as it can to beat up this virus, but that is energy consuming. So at some point when the cytokine level gets too high, it's going to stimulate this dorsal motor nucleus, and we are going to go into shutdown. The body is basically saying, I need to surrender, I need to immobilize, I need to conserve energy to survive, I need to restore and recharge, and we're going to collapse, okay? So that's kind of what parallels what happens with COVID-19 patients when they go in to shock and end up in the ICU and sometimes on a ventilator. And it seems to correlate well with cytokine levels. Let's talk about this pro-social part of our brain that's so important to us. So if you become excessively fearful or panicky, those cytokine levels will go up really high and can precipitate a freeze and faint collapse response. So I'm aware now that I have COVID. I'm aware I'm not breathing well. I'm on my way to the hospital. I am aware that people may die. I come through the doors of a hospital and everybody is in a mask. I can't see any facial expressions. I am disconnected from this humanness of our experience. I'm being treated mainly by robotic people that are whisking me into an isolation room and trying to avoid me, and they're gowned up. I'm taken away from my family. I've been put in isolation, and we know that people who are isolated, they just don't survive very long in general. And all of this is going to further stimulate this threat stress response and jack up my cytokines even more. So people who look relatively good coming through the door within hours are collapsing and being placed on ventilators and passing away. So I think we have to argue that that these pro-inflammatory cytokines are the things we need to be attending to. And we don't really do that. What we tend to do is when people start to exhibit signs of shock, which is simply moving into freeze faint, I need to conserve energy and try to recover, and you hope that you beat the virus up enough to get through that window. A lot of times what we do, because we're so fearful of them dropping their pressure and not perfusing their organ systems and having strokes and heart attacks and kidney failure, is that we try to support their blood pressure and their heart rate by giving them sometimes things that are fight or flight hormones, and we push people back into fight or flight. But their system is already declared, it's exhausted, and it wants to be in freeze and faint and recovery mode, but we're going to push it back into fight or flight and see if we can get keep the immune response going longer and sustain them that way. But eventually the system becomes exhausted, and we have to argue, are we doing them a favor by pushing them back into fight or flight? And that remains unclear. We've got a lot of people looking at things that are going to attack the virus more, but we may be better off looking at how do we manage this cytokine storm more to prevent them getting to the threshold where they actually are forced to flop into freeze and faint. Even one of our local companies is looking at using natural killer cells, which are immune cells, white cells that go out and attack viruses, but they also secrete cytokines. So if we infuse somebody with these natural killer cells trying to fight off the viral load, and we actually end up producing a higher cytokine load, we may kill them faster. So we need to be aware of all of this. And so the question is, what are the things that we can be doing to try to prevent people's cytokine load from going through the roof and causing this profound decompensation? And I think that is the direction that we really need to go in and start exploring. We may not have the capability to do it in this crisis, but we certainly need to be ready to do it in the next. I mean, some of the things, basic things, are to make sure people are not fearful, to somehow figure out a way, even though we may be physically distancing, that we're not socially distancing. So we've used social distancing inappropriately. We need to convert the term to physical distancing, and we need to talk about the fact that we need to stay emotionally, socially, and spiritually connected. If we can go through these infections staying emotionally, socially, and spiritually connected, we will drop the cytokine load, and that will allow for greater survival. Now, that's not something we're real comfortable with in Western medicine, but we need to look at that, and we can increase our survival rates. We can increase our immunity, period, and have more people who can handle this type of a virus without getting extremely sick. And the types of stuff we're talking about here, interestingly, are good for all of us, and they do no harm. And that's our oath. At first, do no harm. So we need to look at all these ways that we can engage the system before the cytokine level gets too high and we collapse. I do want to mention real quickly, though, within this context of dropping our overall threat stress load, dropping our cytokine levels, all of the other things, other than this just physiologic stuff, but the other things in our world, as I like to say, this stuff is the waves crashing on the shore. Where these waves come from is this vast ocean, and what's out there in that ocean. We live in a society where we're constantly distracted. We don't have enough time to relax and reset and lower our threat stress response. We live in a culture of chronic analysis and cognitive overload. We know that when the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is overloaded for a while doing intense cognitive tasks, we show all the signals of threat stress. Our physiology converts to threat stress. We become, our dorsolateral, our cognition, our IQ starts to drop. It gets weary. We also become grumpy and irritable and selfish just by an excessive cognitive overload. We have a society where we're chronically comparing ourselves to other people and feeling inferior. This is done through social media, advertisement, and marketing campaigns. We have a poor education system that limits opportunity, that activates threat stress. We have a lot of people who get entrapped in dead-end jobs, and that elevates threat stress. We have low wages, we have income and wealth disparity, and that creates threat stress. Financial insecurity is a form of spiritual pain. We have a chronic work syndrome in the United States. Again, we don't get time to reset and to deal with our emotions before we've got to get up and go again. We have very poor health care coverage, including mental health and addiction coverage for people. And as I said before, every psychiatric diagnosis we have is associated with high cytokine levels. We have an epidemic of ignored children. Some of them have severe adverse childhood events. Some of them seem relatively minor, but they carry those forward into adulthood and a hyperactive threat-stress response. We have an epidemic of homelessness. We have a corrupt political system that doesn't work for us, but works for big corporations. We have global pandemics. This is a list that was created quite a long time ago, and global pandemics was on there. We have global warming. We have increasing weather disasters that create crisis, not dissimilar, but not exactly the same as a COVID-19 crisis. We've been experiencing chronic war. We have chronic feelings of threat and persecution, particularly racism and targeting of minorities now being done by politicians. We have toxic political and social groups. We have a biased criminal justice system that increases threat, stress in people, makes them physically sick, makes them emotionally sick, spiritually sick. And when people are in threat and stress, this is what the biology tells them to do. And this is what our criminals look like. We need to treat their threat and stress and drop their cytokine levels in order to rehabilitate them. But we don't. We threaten them and we punish them, thinking it's going to work. It will never work. As long as they're threatened and punished, they will continue to exist in this amoral side of our character and not be good citizens, as we would say, not engage in the social constructs of our culture. We have mass murders that increase threat stress. We have gangs and terrorism, and most of these folks are young but adult males who feel disenfranchised. They feel somehow threatened, and their response is to commit asocial acts. We have a number of foreign threats: ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Russia, North Korea, Iran, the drug cartels. We have some fake threats, like immigrants are a threat. Right now we have crops that can't be picked because we don't have the immigrant workforce to do that. And yet we are villainizing an entire population for no good reason. And we simply have the human condition that we're relatively frail in this world. We don't have a lot of control in this world. We are being taught a lesson by, whether you want to call it Mother Nature or God, that the hubris of human beings pales in comparison to the power of nature. Let's put it that way. And we need to be humbled by this event and try to act more appropriately. So, having said all that, I'll have another session where we'll talk more in depth about the things that we can do to help quiet our threat stress response.